Hey guys, today we're in ancient Rome, but not the Rome you've seen in movies with marble temples glowing under the sun. We're here after dark, when the streets empty fast and doors get barred from the inside. Most Romans spent their nights in ways that would feel completely foreign to us, and if you heard footsteps outside your door after sunset, you didn't investigate. You stayed quiet and hoped whoever it was kept walking. The sun is setting now over the 7 hills, casting long shadows across the forum. Workers are packing up their tools, shopkeepers are closing wooden shutters, and the noise of the city is shifting from productive chaos to something more cautious. You can hear the last calls of street vendors, the clatter of carts being pulled away, the sound of 1,000 doors closing almost in unison. Within an hour, the transformation will be complete, and Rome will become a different place entirely. For most Romans, nighttime wasn't an extension of the day. It was a separate world with separate rules, and those rules were simple: stay inside, stay quiet, and wait for morning. The wealthy had oil lamps and slaves to guard them, but even they understood that darkness belonged to forces they couldn't fully control. The poor, crammed into towering apartment buildings called insulae, had even less. No lights in the hallways, no locks worth trusting, and walls so thin you could hear your neighbors breathing. Darkness came fast in Rome. There was no gradual dimming of streetlights, no glow from windows keeping the city half awake. When the sun dropped below the horizon, shadows swallowed entire neighborhoods. The only light came from occasional torches carried by the rich or from the small oil lamps that families could afford to keep burning. Most couldn't afford to waste oil, so they sat in near darkness, letting their eyes adjust, learning to navigate their own homes by memory and touch. The streets, so crowded and vibrant during the day, became dangerous corridors. Roman law technically allowed people to move freely at night, but common sense said otherwise. Gangs roamed looking for easy targets, drunks stumbled out of taverns looking for fights, and chamber pots were emptied from upper-story windows without warning. The poet Juvenal wrote that a man was foolish to go to dinner without making out his will first, because walking home after dark was genuinely life-threatening. If you were wealthy enough, you travelled at night with an entourage. Slaves carried torches to light your way, and armed guards walked ahead to clear the path and discourage thieves. Even then, there were no guarantees. Robbery was common, and murder wasn't unheard of. The city had a fire brigade called the Vigiles, who also functioned as a kind of night watch, but they were stretched thin, underpaid, and often more interested in extorting bribes than preventing crime. For everyone else, the strategy was simple: get home before dark and stay there. Families gathered in their small rooms as the last light faded, pulling shutters closed and sliding wooden bars across doors. In the insula, where most Romans lived, this meant entire families sharing a single room. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all pressed together for warmth and safety. Privacy was a luxury that didn't exist after sunset. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared. Rome had hot summers, but even those nights could be cool, and winter nights were brutal. Most homes had no heating beyond a small brazier filled with charcoal, and even that was a fire hazard in wooden buildings. Families wrapped themselves in wool blankets that smelled of smoke and sweat, layering their bodies together because shared warmth was the only warmth available. The smell inside these rooms was thick and inescapable. Cooking odours from dinner, mostly bread and thin porridge seasoned with garum, a fermented fish sauce that Romans put on everything. Sweat from bodies that bathed maybe once a week if they were lucky. Smoke from oil lamps and charcoal braziers. Chamber pots that sat in corners waiting to be emptied in the morning. And underneath it all, the musty smell of damp wool and old wood. The smell of a city that didn't have running water above the ground floor. Children pressed against their parents, not just for warmth, but for comfort. Roman nights were frightening for adults, and they were terrifying for children. The darkness was absolute in most homes, broken only by the weak flicker of a single oil lamp. Shadows moved on the walls in ways that made the imagination run wild. Strange sounds came from the street, from neighbouring rooms, from the building itself as it settled and creaked. Roman parents told their children that the household gods, the lares, watched over them at night. Small shrines sat in corners of rooms, holding tiny statues and offerings of food. Before sleep, families would say prayers, asking for protection through the dark hours. It wasn't just ritual. It was genuine belief born from genuine fear. Night was when the boundary between the living world and the world of spirits grew thin, and Romans took that seriously. Dogs were common in Roman households, not as pets, but as guards and alarms. A dog sleeping near the door would wake at the sound of footsteps, its growl alerting the family to possible danger. Some families kept geese for the same reason. They were loud, aggressive, and impossible to sneak past. The animals served a practical purpose, but they also provided psychological comfort. You weren't alone in the dark if something with sharper senses than yours was listening too. The wealthiest Romans lived in a different nighttime world, though not as different as you might think. Their homes, called domus, were larger and more comfortable, with multiple rooms arranged around a central courtyard called an atrium. They had more oil lamps, better quality wool, and slaves who stayed awake to tend fires and watch for intruders. But even wealth couldn't buy safety from fire, couldn't silence the distant screams from the street, couldn't keep the cold from seeping through shuttered windows. In these homes, dinner could stretch late into the evening. The cena, the main meal of the day, was a social event for the upper classes, with multiple courses served on couches in a dining room called the triclinium. Guests reclined, eating with their hands, drinking wine mixed with water, talking politics and philosophy, while slaves moved silently in the background refilling cups. The room would be lit with dozens of oil lamps, creating an island of light and warmth in a city gone dark. But even these gatherings ended eventually. Guests would leave with their torch-bearing slaves, and the household would begin its nightly routine. Slaves would extinguish most of the lamps to conserve oil, bank the fires to keep coals glowing until morning, and take up positions near doors and in hallways. The master and his family would retire to their cubicular, small bedrooms that were surprisingly sparse even in wealthy homes. Roman beds were wooden frames strung with leather straps or rope, topped with a mattress stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers if you were particularly rich. Pillows were small and firm, stuffed with feathers or wool. Blankets were heavy wool, sometimes multiple layers in winter. The beds were shorter than modern ones because Romans often slept in a semi-reclined position, propped up on pillows. Lying completely flat was associated with death, and some Romans considered it unlucky. The rooms themselves were small and windowless in many cases, or had only a small opening high on the wall for ventilation. This was intentional. Small rooms were easier to heat, and windows were vulnerabilities, places where intruders could enter or harmful spirits could pass through. The darkness in these rooms was complete, the kind of darkness that modern people almost never experience. No ambient light from streetlights, no glow from alarm clocks or phone chargers, just absolute pressing blackness. In this darkness, Romans developed a different relationship with sleep than we have. They didn't expect to sleep straight through the night. Instead, they practiced what historians now call biphasic sleep, a pattern that was common across the ancient world and continued in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. You went to sleep shortly after dark, slept for 3 or 4 hours, then woke naturally in the middle of the night. This wasn't insomnia, it was normal. During this wakeful period, which could last an hour or two, Romans did quiet activities. Some prayed, speaking softly to their household gods or to larger deities like Jupiter or Vesta. Some had sex. Medical texts from the period suggest this was considered a healthier time for intercourse than immediately before sleep. Some did light work by lamplight, though this was expensive and usually reserved for important tasks. Many simply lay in the darkness and thought. Philosophers wrote about using this time for reflection and meditation. It was considered a gift, a period of quiet in a world that was relentlessly noisy during daylight hours. No obligations, no interruptions, just you and your thoughts in the silent darkness. After this wakeful period, you would drift back into what was called second sleep, sleeping until dawn. This pattern meant that Romans were never deeply asleep for long stretches. They were always somewhat alert, always listening. This was survival instinct in a world where real dangers existed. Fire was the greatest fear. Rome was a city built mostly of wood, heated by open flames and lit by oil lamps that could tip over. The insulae, those apartment buildings where most people lived, were essentially kindling towers waiting for a spark. Fires started constantly, often in the middle of the night when lamps were knocked over or braziers weren't properly extinguished. The smell of smoke sent people into immediate panic. You could hear it in the sudden shouting, the thunder of feet on stairs, the screams of people trapped on upper floors. The insulae had narrow staircases, sometimes only one exit, and in a fire those stairways became death traps. The vigiles, Rome's fire brigade and night watch, did what they could. They patrolled the streets with buckets and pumps, responding to fires as quickly as possible. But their equipment was primitive, their numbers were small, and Rome was huge. By the time they arrived, a fire could already be consuming an entire building. People trapped on 4th or 5th floors had a terrible choice: burn or jump. Many jumped. Romans slept lightly, not just because of fire, but because of the constant noise. The insulae had walls made of mud, brick and wood, with almost no sound insulation. You could hear everything your neighbours did. Conversations, arguments, crying babies, snoring, coughing, the sounds of sex, the sounds of violence. It created an atmosphere where privacy was impossible and sleep was always fragile. Children cried in the night, and there was no way to completely soothe them in those conditions. Cold, uncomfortable, frightened by shadows and sounds, they would wake and whimper. Mothers would nurse infants, rock them, whisper the same prayers their own mothers had whispered. Older children learned to stay quiet, to not complain, because complaining wouldn't change anything. You endured the night, and you waited for dawn. The poor slept whenever exhaustion forced them to. Day labourers and construction workers were so physically drained that they could collapse on a straw mat and sleep through almost anything. But even they woke sometimes in the dark hours, joints aching from hard labour, stomachs empty because one meal a day was often all they could afford. They would lie there in the darkness, listening to the city, waiting for the first signs of morning. Insects made sleep even more difficult. Fleas bred in the straw mattresses, biting constantly through the night, leaving red welts that itched for days. Bedbugs lived in the wooden bed frames, emerging after dark to feed on sleeping bodies. Lice nested in hair and clothing, spreading from person to person in the crowded conditions. Families spent time each evening picking parasites from each other's hair, crushing them between thumbnails, a ritual that was both practical hygiene and social bonding. Some Romans tried remedies to keep insects away, rubbing the skin with certain oils, burning specific herbs, hanging bundles of plants near the bed. Most of these remedies didn't work, but the act of trying provided psychological comfort. You were doing something, taking action against the discomfort, even if that action was mostly futile. And occasionally, through luck or actual effectiveness, something would seem to help. And that remedy would be passed down through families as treasured knowledge. The sounds of the night became familiar background noise that Romans learned to sleep through. The distant bark of dogs, always present in a city where strays roamed freely. The occasional shout from the street, drunk or angry or in pain. The creak of wooden buildings settling, wood contracting in the cool night air. The scurry of rats in the walls, constant companions in a city with no effective pest control. These sounds marked normal nights, the baseline of urban existence. A woman's scream, high and terrified, that spoke of violence happening nearby. Romans learned young which sounds required immediate attention and which could be ignored. The hours between midnight and dawn were the deepest part of night, when even the most resilient felt vulnerable. The cold was worse then, seeping through walls and shutters, making blankets feel inadequate. The darkness felt heavier, more oppressive, as if night itself had weight. Time moved strangely in those hours, stretching and contracting, making it hard to judge whether dawn was still hours away or approaching soon. This was when the spirits were believed to be most active. The lemures and larvae, those restless dead who hadn't found peace, wandered most freely in the darkest hours. Romans who woke during this time would lie very still, listening, hoping not to hear anything that might confirm the presence of something supernatural. They whispered prayers silently, asking the household gods for continued protection, promising offerings in the morning if they survived until sunrise. Men sometimes lay awake thinking about their debts, their work, their standing in the community. Roman society was intensely hierarchical and competitive, and maintaining your position required constant effort and vigilance. A business deal gone wrong, an insult from someone more powerful, a favour owed that couldn't be repaid. All these worries grew larger in the night hours. Plans were made and revised, imaginary conversations rehearsed, solutions that seemed brilliant in darkness, but often proved foolish in daylight. Women's nighttime thoughts circled around family and survival. Children's health, always precarious in a world where simple infections could kill. Food stores, whether there was enough grain to last until the next market day, whether the preserved foods were still safe to eat. Relationships with neighbors, crucial for mutual support, but easily damaged by perceived slights or accumulated grievances. The constant calculation of resources against needs, trying to stretch too little across too many demands. Slaves lay awake knowing they had no control over their lives. Their thoughts were shaped by immediate fear and long-term hopelessness. Would tomorrow bring punishment for some perceived failure? Would they be sold, separated from whatever family or friends they'd managed to form? Would their master's financial troubles lead to them being sold to someone crueler? The best a slave could hope for was a master who wasn't actively brutal, work that wasn't literally killing them, and maybe, if fortune smiled, eventual freedom. But freedom seemed impossibly distant in the dark hours before dawn. Children who woke in the night often felt pure, uncomplicated fear. They didn't understand the economic and social complexities that worried their parents. They just knew that darkness was frightening, that strange sounds were terrifying, that the world felt dangerous in ways they couldn't articulate. They would lie still, afraid to move and draw attention, afraid to call out and be scolded for disturbing others, trying to will themselves back to sleep, counting breaths or repeating simple prayers until exhaustion finally reclaimed them. The elderly often slept worst of all. Their bodies ached from decades of hard physical labor, joints stiff and painful in the cold night air. They had survived so much, seen so many die, that they were acutely aware of their own mortality. Every unusual pain, every irregular heartbeat, every moment of breathlessness could be the beginning of the end. They would lie in darkness, reviewing their lives, hoping they'd done enough to secure a proper burial, worrying about family members they'd leave behind. For all Romans, regardless of status or age, the goal was simply to survive the night, to wake at dawn with everyone accounted for, the home intact, ready to face another day. There was no expectation of comfortable sleep, of waking refreshed and energized. The bar for a successful night was set remarkably low, yet many nights failed to clear even that minimal standard. As the night progressed, subtle changes marked the passage of time. The quality of darkness shifted, imperceptibly at first, in the hours before dawn. The cold deepened, reaching its peak just before sunrise. The sounds of the city changed, the late-night revelers finally silent, the early workers not yet stirring, creating a brief period of genuine quiet that was rare in Rome at any other time. Roosters began their crowing in stages. The first bird would start while the sky was still completely black, making other Romans curse the animal for its poor timing. But gradually, over the next hour, more roosters would join, creating a growing chorus that marked dawn's approach. These birds served as the city's alarm clock, impossible to ignore, announcing to everyone that the night was ending. Professional bakers were already deep into their work by this time. Their ovens had been lit hours earlier, fired with wood until they reached the intense heat needed for bread. Apprentices worked in the pre-dawn darkness, shaping dough by feel and long practice, sliding loaves into ovens with long wooden peels. The smell of baking bread began to drift through streets, one of the first sensory signals that morning was coming. This smell carried profound meaning for Romans. Bread was the foundation of their diet, distributed free to citizens as part of the grain dole, supplemented by what people could buy or bake themselves. The smell of fresh bread meant sustenance, meant survival, meant the city's complex system of food supply was functioning. On a more emotional level, it meant morning, meant safety, meant the dangerous hours of night were ending. No smell was more welcome to Romans waking in darkness. Other early workers began stirring. Water carriers who would fill the city's fountains, cleaners who would sweep yesterday's refuse from the streets, merchants who needed to travel to docks or gates to meet incoming goods. These people moved through the dark streets with purpose, carrying small lamps or torches, navigating by memory and experience, part of the invisible infrastructure that kept Rome functioning. The sky finally began to lighten, the change subtle at first, deep black fading to dark blue. Stars that had been brilliant all night started to dim, the brightest hanging on longest, refusing to yield to day. The morning star, Venus, when it appeared in this position, gleamed in the eastern sky, and Romans who saw it would whisper quick prayers or make wishes, seeing the planet as a messenger between night and day. Women's experience of Roman nights was shaped by vulnerability and responsibility. Respectable women, those from citizen families, were expected to stay indoors after dark. Venturing out at night marked you as either desperate or disreputable. The streets after dark belonged to prostitutes who worked from taverns and brothels, and to the occasional wealthy woman travelling in a covered litter with guards. Everyone else stayed home. Inside those homes, women's work didn't stop at sunset. They tended fires, nursed infants, cared for sick family members, and supervised household slaves if they had any. Wealthy women might have slaves to do the physical work, but they were still responsible for managing the household, and that responsibility didn't pause for sleep. If a child woke sick in the night, if a fire needed tending, if a slave needed instruction, the matron of the house was expected to handle it. For poor women, night was just another shift in an endless workday. They might spend evening hours spinning wool by lamplight if they could afford the oil, preparing food for the next day, or simply trying to keep children calm and quiet so the whole family could rest. Their bodies ached from carrying water, grinding grain, washing clothes in cold water, and doing all the physical labor that made a household function. Slave women had the worst of it. They were on call at all hours, expected to respond immediately if their master or mistress called. Some slept outside their owner's bedroom door, literally on the threshold, so they could respond instantly. Others slept in kitchens or workshops, always partially alert for the sound of their name. And some faced the darker reality of slavery. Sexual exploitation that happened in the darkness, away from public view. Midwives worked at night because babies came when they came. A slave or servant would pound on the midwife's door in the middle of the night, and she would gather her tools and follow them through dangerous streets to attend a birth. Childbirth was life-threatening in Rome, and doing it by lamplight in a room heated by a single brazier made it even more so. The midwife would work for hours, sometimes until dawn, guiding a woman through labor while praying that both mother and child would survive. Children learned fear at night. Roman culture was full of stories about things that hunted in the darkness. Lemures were the spirits of the restless dead, those who died violently or weren't properly buried. They wandered at night looking for the living, and their presence was marked by strange sounds, cold spots, and feelings of dread. Strix were even worse. These were demons that took the form of birds, flying through the night and attacking infants. They would enter through windows, perch over cradles, and drink the blood of babies. This wasn't just superstition. It was how Romans explained sudden infant death, which was common in a world without modern medicine. If your baby died in the night, it was because a Strix had found it. Parents hung protective amulets over cradles and rubbed doorways with garlic to keep these creatures out. Owls were birds of ill omen. Hearing an owl call at night, especially near your home, meant death was coming. Romans would perform protective rituals immediately, spitting 3 times and turning their clothes inside out to confuse evil spirits. Dogs howling at night were another bad sign because dogs could see spirits that humans couldn't. A howling dog wasn't just being noisy. It was warning you that something unnatural was present. Crossroads were particularly dangerous at night. Romans believed that these places where 2 roads met were liminal spaces where the boundaries between worlds were weakest. Spirits gathered at crossroads, and so did bandits and murderers. If you had to pass through a crossroads at night, you walked quickly and you didn't look to the sides. You kept your eyes forward and your mind on prayers. The festival of Lemuria showed how seriously Romans took these night spirits. For 3 nights in May, the father of each household would wake at midnight and perform a ritual. He would walk through the house barefoot, making a gesture with his thumb between his fingers to ward off evil, spitting black beans from his mouth and repeating 9 times, "With these beans I redeem me and mine." He never looked back, because the lemures were following him, collecting the beans. After walking through every room, he would wash his hands in spring water, clash bronze pots together, and command the spirits to leave. 9 times he would say, "Ghosts of my fathers, go forth." This wasn't theatre. This was genuine magical practice meant to protect the family from supernatural harm. The beans represented life and fertility, offered to the dead in exchange for being left alone. The bronze pots were clashed to drive away any spirits that refused the offering. And the repetition of 9 times was powerful magic, because 9 was a number sacred to the underworld. Children watched these rituals and learned that night was when the barriers between the living and the dead grew thin. They learned that darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was the presence of danger, natural and supernatural. They learned to stay quiet, to stay still, to not draw attention to themselves when the sun was down. And they learned that survival meant respecting things you couldn't see or understand. But night didn't belong only to fear and caution. Rome had a thriving night economy, a shadow world that came alive after respectable people closed their doors. Taverns stayed open late, especially in neighborhoods near the ports and military camps. These weren't respectable establishments. They were dark, smoky rooms where wine was cheap, food was cheaper, and entertainment came in various forms. The customers were laborers, soldiers, sailors, freedmen, slaves sent on errands, and anyone else who had reason or excuse to be out after dark. They sat on wooden benches at rough tables, drinking wine that was more vinegar than grape, eating bread and olives and whatever hot food the tavern offered. The air was thick with smoke from oil lamps and from customers themselves, unwashed bodies pressed together in small spaces. Gambling happened constantly. Dice games were technically illegal, but that didn't stop anyone. Men crouched in corners, shaking dice in cups, betting coins or trinkets or promises. Fights broke out when someone was accused of cheating, which was often. Knives came out, blood hit the floor, and the tavern keeper would throw both parties into the street to settle it elsewhere. The vigiles rarely intervened unless the fighting spread or a fire started. Many taverns doubled as brothels. Prostitution was legal in Rome, taxed by the state and regulated to some degree, though those regulations meant little in practice. Women worked from small rooms upstairs or from curtained alcoves in the tavern itself. Their names and prices were sometimes written on the wall outside. The transactions were quick and businesslike, just another form of commerce in a city where everything had a price. The sound in these taverns was constant. Men shouting, laughing, arguing. Dice clattering on wooden tables, cups slamming down. Occasional screams from upstairs, either pleasure or violence, often hard to distinguish. Music sometimes, a flute player or someone with a lyre, hired to provide atmosphere. And underneath it all, the murmur of dozens of conversations, deals being made, insults being traded, lies being told. The wealthy occasionally slummed in these places, disguised in plain cloaks, seeking the thrill of crossing social boundaries. A senator could sit next to a dock worker and both could be equally drunk, at least for a few hours. It was one of the few places in Rome where class distinctions blurred, though never disappeared entirely. The wealthy could always leave and return to their safe homes. The poor had to stay in this world. Some businesses worked exclusively at night. Bakers started their work around 2 a.m, firing their ovens and preparing dough so that fresh bread would be ready by dawn. The smell of baking bread was one of the first signs that night was ending, that Rome was beginning to wake. It was a comforting smell, the promise of food and morning and an end to darkness. Fullers, who cleaned and processed cloth, also worked at night sometimes. Their work involved soaking fabric in vats of urine and other chemicals, a process that smelled terrible and took hours. Doing it at night meant fewer complaints from neighbors, though the smell still drifted through streets and seeped into buildings. People who lived near fulleries learned to sleep with cloths stuffed in their window openings, trying to block the stench. Cart traffic was restricted during daylight hours in Rome because the streets were too crowded. So wagons and carts carrying goods moved at night, their wooden wheels thundering over stone pavement. If you lived near a major road, the noise was constant from sunset to dawn. The sound of hooves, wheels, shouting drivers, all echoing through streets that were otherwise relatively quiet. It made sleep difficult, but it kept the city supplied. The public baths, the thermae, stayed open into the evening hours. Some wealthy Romans made a social event of bathing after dinner, spending an hour or two in the warm rooms, getting massaged with oil, scraping their skin clean with a strigil, soaking in hot pools, and then plunging into cold baths. It was a time for gossip and business deals, for seeing and being seen. Walking home from the baths after dark was when you were most vulnerable. You were relaxed, possibly a bit drunk from wine consumed during or after bathing, carrying your belongings in a cloth bag. Thieves knew this and waited near the baths for easy targets. If you were smart, you brought slaves to guard you and light your way. If you weren't, you walked quickly and hoped luck was with you. Some religious activities happened at night, though not always with official approval. Mystery cults, religions that promised secret knowledge and salvation, often held their ceremonies after dark. The cult of Mithras met in underground chambers, initiating new members through rituals that involved darkness, symbolic death, and rebirth. The cult of Isis held nocturnal processions with torches and music, honoring the Egyptian goddess who promised life after death. Christianity, during its early centuries in Rome, was illegal and persecuted. Christians met at night in secret, in private homes, or in the catacombs outside the city where they buried their dead. These gatherings were dangerous. If discovered, participants could be arrested, tortured, executed. But night provided cover, and the Christian community grew in these hidden hours, passing the faith from person to person in whispered conversations by lamplight. The appeal of these nighttime religions was partly the secrecy itself. In a society where everything was public and regulated, where your social status determined every aspect of your life, the darkness offered a space where those rules could be temporarily suspended. A slave and a senator could worship side by side in a Mithraic temple, both stripped of their daytime identities. A woman could hold religious authority in her home during a Christian meeting, something impossible in traditional Roman religion. But these activities carried real risk. The Roman state took religion seriously, and unauthorized religious gatherings were seen as potential threats to social order. The vigiles and other authorities raided suspected meeting places, arrested participants, and made examples of leaders. The darkness that provided cover also provided deniability for violence. Many people who attended these secret ceremonies simply disappeared, and their families never learned what happened. Most Romans, though, avoided any activity that might draw official attention. They stayed home, slept their broken sleep, and waited for dawn. The night was for enduring, not for living. It was a necessary evil, a pause in the real business of existence that happened during daylight. The goal was simply to survive it without loss or harm, to wake in the morning with your family intact and your home still standing. There was no expectation of comfortable sleep, of waking refreshed and energized. The bar for a successful night was set remarkably low, yet many nights failed to clear even that minimal standard. Fire was always the nightmare scenario. It started so easily and spread so fast. An oil lamp knocked over by a restless sleeper, a spark from a brazier landing on a wool blanket, a cooking fire not properly extinguished. Within minutes, flames could engulf a room, and within an hour, an entire insula could be burning. The wooden construction and packed-together buildings meant that fires often jumped from one structure to another. The sound of a fire alarm, someone in the street shouting, "Fire!" or the vigils blowing their whistles caused instant panic. Families had seconds to react. Grab the children, forget the possessions. Down the narrow staircase, pushing through smoke, hoping the stairs weren't already engulfed. Many people died in these moments, trapped on upper floors as fire consumed the only exit, or crushed in stampedes as dozens of people tried to force their way through a single doorway. Those who escaped stood in the street and watched everything they owned burn. Their home, their clothes, their tools, their food stores, all reduced to ash while they stood helpless. The vigils fought the fire with pumps and buckets, but their main strategy was often to tear down neighboring buildings to create a fire break, preventing the fire from spreading further. They were trying to save the block, not the building. If your home was on fire, it was already lost. Morning after a major fire revealed the damage. Blackened shells of buildings, bodies pulled from the wreckage, families sitting in the street with nothing left. The smell of smoke lingered for days, and the survivors had to figure out how to rebuild their lives from nothing. Some had relatives who took them in. Others became homeless, joining the masses of people who lived in the streets or in the most desperate slums. But fire wasn't the only disaster that could strike at night. Violence was common and often random. A drunk stumbling home might kill someone in a fight over nothing. A thief surprised during a break-in might murder a household rather than risk being identified. Political enemies might send assassins who struck in the dark hours when victims were vulnerable and witnesses were few. Bodies appeared in the morning, and usually no one was punished. The vigils investigated if the victim was important enough, but most murders went unsolved. Justice in Rome was for citizens with money and connections. If you were poor, your death might not even be officially recorded. You just vanished, and your family had to deal with it. Women faced particular dangers at night, especially those who had no choice but to be out after dark. Prostitutes were beaten by customers or pimps, and no one intervened. Slave women sent on nighttime errands were vulnerable to assault, and their masters rarely cared as long as the errand was completed. Even free women of the lower classes, if forced out at night by necessity, could be attacked with little legal recourse. The darkness provided cover for every kind of cruelty. Things that would be too risky in daylight happened routinely at night. Kidnappings, especially of children who could be sold as slaves. Rape, frequent and rarely prosecuted. Robbery that turned into murder when victims resisted. The night was when civilization's veneer wore thin and Rome's underlying brutality showed itself clearly. Yet people adapted, as humans always do. They learned to read the sounds of the night, distinguishing between normal noise and threatening noise. They developed strategies for staying safe. They formed neighborhood networks, informal groups that looked out for each other. They taught their children what to fear and how to respond. And they maintained faith that morning would come, because it always had before. Some nights were different, breaks in the usual pattern. Festival nights were times when the normal rules relaxed. During Saturnalia in December, the winter solstice celebration, Rome transformed. Masters served their slaves dinner, gifts were exchanged, gambling was openly permitted, and celebrations ran late into the night. The streets filled with people, torches were everywhere, and for a few nights you could walk outside after dark without fear. The atmosphere during Saturnalia was surreal. Role reversals were not just permitted but expected. Slaves could insult their masters without punishment. Children stayed up late. Normal social boundaries were suspended, and for a brief period Rome became something like the fantasy version of itself that appeared in poetry. People sang in the streets. Strangers shared wine, and the darkness felt less threatening because everyone was out in it together. But even festival nights had their dangers. The freedom led to excess led to conflict, and conflict led to violence. The morning after Saturnalia often brought hangovers and regret, along with the restoration of normal hierarchy. The slave who insulted his master during the festival had to serve that master again the next day, and both knew the boundaries had to be redrawn. The brief glimpse of equality made the return to normal even harder to bear. Religious festivals often involved nighttime processions. Torchlight parades wound through the streets, priests chanting, musicians playing, crowds following along. These events were spectacular, with the flickering torches creating dramatic shadows and the collective voice of hundreds of people creating a sound that echoed off buildings. It was Rome at its most theatrical, conscious of itself as a civilization putting on a show. New Year celebrations, marking the beginning of the Roman year in March, involved similar nighttime festivities. Families stayed up until dawn, making offerings to Janus, the god of beginnings and endings, asking for his favor in the coming year. Children were kept awake with stories and small gifts, and the night was filled with hope and prayer, rather than fear. But not all special nights were joyful. When an emperor died, the news spread through the city at night as messengers rode to inform key officials and military commanders. The reaction depended on how the emperor was perceived. A beloved emperor's death brought genuine mourning, crowds gathering in the streets, weeping, calling out to the gods. A hated emperor's death brought celebration disguised as shock, with people quietly rejoicing while publicly pretending to grieve. Political upheavals often happened at night. Coups were planned in darkness and executed at dawn. Generals moved troops into position under cover of night, waiting for first light to make their move. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal military unit, was notorious for midnight meetings where they decided which emperor would rule and which would die. Night was when power changed hands, away from public view. Plague outbreaks brought their own nighttime horrors. When disease swept through Rome, as it did several times in the city's history, carts would roll through streets at night collecting bodies. Families put their dead outside their doors, and the collectors would load the corpses and take them for mass burial or burning. The sound of those carts, wheels creaking under the weight of the dead, became associated with death itself. During plague nights, people barricaded themselves inside even more thoroughly than usual. The disease was thought to spread through bad air, miasma, and night air was considered especially dangerous. Windows stayed shut despite the heat, and people burned incense and herbs trying to purify the air inside their homes. They prayed desperately, made offerings to healing gods like Apollo and Aesculapius, and waited to see who in the family would fall ill next. Summer nights had their own character. The heat that built up during the day made indoor sleeping impossible for many Romans. Families in the insulae would climb to the roof, spreading blankets on the flat tops of their buildings and sleeping under the open sky. It was the only way to find relief from the heat trapped in their small rooms. These rooftop communities became a nightly gathering. Dozens of families from a single building might all be up there talking quietly, watching the stars, trying to catch any hint of a breeze. Children would fall asleep first, sprawled on blankets, while adults sat and conversed in low voices. Topics ranged from practical concerns to gossip to philosophy, depending on who was present and what was on their minds. The stars above Rome were spectacular. Without any light pollution, the Milky Way stretched across the sky in a luminous band that the Romans called the road to heaven. People who couldn't read or write could read the stars, tracking the movements of planets, identifying constellations, and using the night sky as a calendar. Farmers knew when to plant by watching certain stars rise at dawn. Sailors knew how to navigate by them. Philosophers gazed at the stars and pondered humanity's place in the cosmos. The Stoics taught that humans were part of a vast, universal order, and the stars were evidence of that order, perfect and unchanging, while human affairs churned in chaos below. Looking up at them could provide perspective, a reminder that your personal troubles were small in the scope of eternity. But even these peaceful summer nights had their interruptions. Mosquitoes bred in the Tiber River and in the stagnant water that collected around fountains and aqueducts. They swarmed at night, biting exposed skin, spreading malaria and other diseases. People tried to protect themselves with netting or by sleeping under cloaks, but it was only partially effective. The whine of mosquitoes became another sound of summer nights, along with the conversations and the occasional dog barking. Thunderstorms were both relief and terror. The rain cooled the air and broke the heat, but lightning was seen as a direct manifestation of Jupiter's power. If lightning struck your home, it was a sign of divine displeasure. The area where lightning hit became religiously contaminated and had to be purified through ritual. People stayed indoors during storms, away from windows, praying that the god's anger would pass over them. The experience of Roman nights varied dramatically depending on where you lived within the city itself. Rome wasn't a uniform urban landscape, but a patchwork of distinct neighborhoods, each with its own character, its own dangers, its own nighttime rhythms. The Suburra, Rome's most notorious district, was where the poorest lived in the tallest, most precarious insulae. Here, nighttime was particularly lawless, with criminal gangs operating openly and the vigils rarely bothering to patrol. In the Suburra, the darkness was thicker somehow, more oppressive. The buildings were so tall and packed so closely together that even during the day, sunlight barely reached the lower floors. At night, the narrow alleys became absolute black tunnels where anything could happen, and often did. Prostitutes worked from ground-floor rooms with oil lamps in the windows, the only reliable source of light in streets where respectable people never ventured after dark. The sounds of the Suburra at night were distinctive, more violent, more desperate than other parts of Rome. You could hear gambling disputes escalating into knife fights, hear women screaming as customers or pimps turned violent, hear the vigils occasionally making a show of force, their whistles and shouts echoing off the walls before they retreated to safer neighborhoods. The Suburra was where Rome's nighttime violence was most concentrated, where life was cheapest, where mourning often revealed bodies that no one would claim or investigate. Families in the Suburra developed even stricter survival strategies than Romans elsewhere. Children were taught never to go near windows at night, never to respond if they heard their name called from the street, never to open the door for any reason until full daylight. Mothers would tie ropes around their children's wrists at night, connecting the whole family so that if one person was taken, the others would wake immediately. It sounds paranoid until you understand that child kidnapping was common, that slavers knew the Suburra's poor had no resources to fight back. The Suburra also had the worst fire record in Rome. The buildings were older, more poorly maintained, packed with more people than they were designed to hold. When fire started there, it could consume an entire block before the vigils even arrived. and they often let Subura buildings burn rather than risk their limited equipment trying to save structures they considered already lost. The survivors of Subura fires usually had nothing, not even the minimal possessions that residents of better neighborhoods might save. In contrast, the neighborhoods on the Palatine Hill, where the wealthiest Romans lived, experienced night differently. Here, the streets were wider, better maintained, and actually patrolled by private security forces hired by residents. The homes were proper domus, with thick walls, secure gates, and slaves specifically assigned to night watch duty. The wealthy still faced the same darkness, the same cold, the same basic limitations of Roman technology. But they faced them with resources that made survival significantly more likely. Wealthy neighborhoods had their own night sounds. The occasional litter being carried past, slaves' footsteps as they moved between households on errands, the low voices of private guards challenging anyone who looked suspicious. Violence here was rarer, more controlled, more likely to be political assassination than random street crime. When wealthy Romans died at night, it was usually because someone powerful wanted them dead, not because they were unlucky enough to encounter a desperate thief. Even within wealthy homes, though, the experience of night varied by status. The master and mistress slept in the best rooms, behind multiple doors, with slaves positioned to wake them if needed. Their children slept nearby, also protected, also warm. But the slaves themselves, the people who made the wealthy family's comfort possible, lived in a different nighttime world entirely. Household slaves slept wherever they could find space. Some had small rooms, barely more than closets, in parts of the house where heat and light never reached. Others slept in hallways, in kitchens after the fires had burned down, in workshops surrounded by the tools of their labor. The most unfortunate slept literally on thresholds, in doorways, positioned so their bodies would block intruders and their sleep would be interrupted by any movement. These threshold slaves existed in a twilight state, never fully asleep, never fully awake. They learned to doze while remaining partially aware of their surroundings, a skill developed through necessity and maintained through fear. If they slept too deeply and failed to wake when their master called, punishment would follow. If they were too alert and disturbed their master with unnecessary responses to normal night sounds, punishment would follow. They walked a razor's edge every night of their lives. Kitchen slaves had it slightly better in terms of warmth, as they could sleep near the remains of cooking fires. But kitchens were also where food was stored, which meant rats were constant nighttime companions. These rats were bold, having learned that sleeping humans were less dangerous than waking ones. Kitchen slaves would wake to find rats running across their bodies, investigating their hair, their clothes, looking for any scrap of food that might be accessible. Some slaves learned to sleep with cloth wrapped around their faces to prevent rats from biting their lips or noses. Field slaves, those who worked on farms outside the city but within the urban estate system that surrounded Rome, had perhaps the worst nighttime experience of all. They were housed in barracks that were essentially animal pens with roofs, packed together on wooden platforms with no bedding beyond straw that was rarely changed. In winter they huddled for warmth. In summer they suffocated in the heat and stench. Guards patrolled outside to prevent escape, but provided no protection from the violence that occurred inside when disputes arose in the darkness. The psychological impact of these nighttime conditions on slaves cannot be overstated. They lived in constant awareness that they had no security, no privacy, no expectation of safety. Their bodies were not their own, available for use by their owners at any hour. Their sleep was conditional, always subject to interruption. Their thoughts during wakeful night hours must have been dominated by hopelessness, by the question of whether their situation would ever improve, by memories of freedom if they'd been born free, or by the absence of any memory of anything better if they'd been born into slavery. Some slaves formed tight bonds with each other during these night hours, whispered conversations in the darkness, sharing warmth and minimal comfort, creating makeshift families among people who understood each other's suffering. These bonds were dangerous because they could be broken at any moment by sale or reassignment, but they were also necessary for psychological survival. Humans need connection, and slaves created it where they could, in the only time when their masters weren't actively watching. The rituals that free Romans practiced at night, the prayers to household gods, the offerings and protective gestures, must have seemed bitterly ironic to slaves who had no household gods of their own. They had been removed from their native religions, forbidden from maintaining their traditional practices, but not fully included in Roman religious life. They existed in a spiritual limbo that matched their social and legal limbo, present but not recognized, human but not granted human dignity. Women's experience of Roman nights deserves deeper exploration beyond what's already been described. For wealthy women, night brought a different kind of vulnerability than physical danger. It brought the vulnerability of their thoughts, the hours when they couldn't distract themselves with social obligations or household management. Roman women, even wealthy ones, had limited control over their lives. They were married off for political alliances, expected to produce legitimate heirs, judged constantly on their adherence to virtue and modesty. At night, lying in darkness next to husbands who might be strangers or might be cruel. These women had time to think about paths not taken, lives not lived. Roman literature occasionally hints at this. Poems written from women's perspectives that describe nighttime as when masks could drop, when the performance of being the ideal Roman matron could pause. But for most women, even their thoughts weren't truly private. The ideal Roman woman was supposed to be content with her role, so discontent, even silently felt in darkness, was a kind of rebellion. For women of the lower classes, night brought more immediate concerns. Survival, always, but also the specific vulnerabilities that came with their gender. Roman law provided some protections for citizen women, but those protections were theoretical and difficult to enforce. A woman walking alone at night, even with legitimate reason, could be assaulted with little legal recourse. She would be asked why she was out, what she was doing, why she hadn't brought male protection. The assault would become her fault for violating social norms. Widows faced particular nighttime difficulties. Roman society expected widows to remarry quickly, especially if they were young enough to bear children. But between the death of one husband and marriage to another, widows lived in a liminal state. They were heads of their households, but not really recognized as such. They were responsible for protecting themselves and their children, but given few tools to do so. At night, widows in insulae would sometimes band together, multiple households sharing space and watch duty, creating makeshift security through numbers. Old women who had survived beyond their childbearing years and beyond their usefulness as wives sometimes found a different role at night. They became the keepers of practical knowledge, the ones who knew how to treat common ailments, how to assist at births, how to prepare bodies for burial. These women moved through nighttime Rome with a kind of immunity born from being both necessary and invisible. They were too old to be targeted for sexual violence, too poor to be worth robbing, but too useful to be cast out entirely. They navigated the darkness with the confidence of people who had nothing left to lose. Pregnancy created its own nighttime terrors for Roman women. Childbirth killed regularly, and every pregnant woman knew she might not survive her delivery. The nights grew longer as pregnancy progressed, filled with fears about the coming ordeal. Would the child be healthy? Would she survive? If she died, who would care for her older children? These weren't abstract worries, but concrete possibilities that every woman had seen play out in her extended family or neighborhood. The actual experience of giving birth at night, which happened frequently enough because labor doesn't wait for convenient timing, was a trial that combined the normal dangers of Roman nights with the specific dangers of childbirth. The midwife had to be fetched, requiring someone to navigate dark streets. Lamps had to be kept burning, expensive but necessary. Water had to be heated, also expensive in terms of fuel. The woman in labor had to stay quiet enough not to disturb neighbors too much, but could scream when the pain became unbearable, because everyone understood that birth was legitimately agonizing. Other women from the neighborhood would sometimes gather to help, creating a temporary community of female support in the darkness. These gatherings served practical purposes, helping with the physical work of birth, but they also served psychological purposes. They reminded the laboring woman that she wasn't alone, that other women had survived this, that there was collective knowledge and collective strength available to her. If she died despite this support, these same women would prepare her body and help care for her children. The bonds formed in these nighttime vigils were sometimes stronger than family bonds. The experience of adolescence in Roman nights hasn't been fully explored yet either. Roman children became adults early by modern standards. Girls were considered marriageable as young as 12, though 14 was more common. Boys took on adult responsibilities in their mid-teens. This transition from childhood to adulthood was marked partly by changes in nighttime behavior and nighttime fears. Young girls approaching marriage age began to understand that they would soon be transferred from their father's household to a husband's household, often to a man they barely knew. The nights before their wedding must have been filled with a mixture of anticipation and terror. They were leaving everything familiar, everyone they'd known, to live with strangers who would have absolute legal authority over them. Some girls were prepared for this, taught what to expect. Others went into marriage almost completely ignorant, and their wedding nights became traumatic initiations into a reality very different from what they'd imagined. Young men faced different nighttime transitions. As they reached the age of taking on adult responsibilities, usually marked by receiving the toga virilis around age 16, they were expected to stop being afraid of the dark, to be able to move through nighttime Rome with confidence. This was often a difficult transition. Fear doesn't disappear because social expectations change. Young men had to learn to mask their fear, to perform confidence they might not feel, to navigate the same dark streets that had terrified them as children while pretending they were no longer afraid. Some young men sought out nighttime adventures as a way of proving their courage. They would venture into dangerous neighborhoods, pick fights with strangers, engage in vandalism or petty crime. These activities were semi-accepted as part of young men learning to be aggressive Roman citizens, though they often resulted in injury or death. Families worried about sons who went out at night, but they also worried about sons who seemed too timid, too reluctant to embrace the violent masculinity that Roman culture expected. Young people of both genders sometimes formed romantic attachments that had to be conducted secretly, and night provided cover for these meetings. Young men would sneak out to meet girls at prearranged locations or would throw stones at windows to wake their beloved for whispered conversations. These meetings were risky for both parties, but especially for the girls, whose reputations could be destroyed if they were caught, while young men faced minimal social consequences. The military experience of Roman knights deserves attention as well. Soldiers, whether stationed in Rome itself or in camps throughout the empire, had their own relationship with darkness. In Rome, the Praetorian Guard and urban cohorts maintained night watch rotations, patrolling streets, responding to fires, theoretically keeping order. These soldiers experienced night as work time, as a shift to be endured, often while dealing with people at their worst, drunk, violent, desperate. Soldiers learned to sleep in shifts, to wake instantly at alarms, to function effectively even when exhausted. This training served them well in military campaigns, where night watches and surprise attacks were constant possibilities, but it also damaged them psychologically. Many soldiers developed chronic sleep problems, never able to fully relax, always partially alert even when off duty. When they retired from service and returned to civilian life, they carried these patterns with them, often struggling to adjust to normal household rhythms. Military camps outside Rome followed strict nighttime protocols. Guards were posted at regular intervals around the perimeter. Passwords were changed nightly. Soldiers slept in their armor or with weapons nearby. The fear wasn't just of human enemies, but of supernatural ones. Soldiers were superstitious, believing that spirits haunted battlefields and followed armies. They performed their own protective rituals, often syncretizing Roman religion with local beliefs from whatever regions they were stationed in, creating hybrid spiritual practices meant to ward off every possible threat. The economic impact of Roman knights should also be considered more fully. The fact that so much of the city shut down after dark represented a massive inefficiency that Romans simply accepted as unavoidable. Businesses lost productive hours. Goods that needed to move across the city had to wait for daylight or pay premium prices for nighttime transport. Workers who could have been productive spent those hours instead huddled in their homes, too afraid to work. This inefficiency wasn't equally distributed. Wealthy families could afford to keep lamps burning and slaves working into the evening. They could conduct business, write correspondence, read and study during hours when poor families were sitting in darkness. This gave wealthy Romans more effective hours in each day, a compound advantage that helped them maintain and increase their wealth relative to the poor. Some industries did adapt to work at night despite the challenges. As mentioned, bakers started their work in the early morning hours, but there were others too. Thieves, obviously, worked at night, and while this was criminal activity, it was also a form of nighttime economy. Smugglers moved goods under cover of darkness, avoiding taxes and customs fees. Illegal gambling operators ran games in back rooms. Prohibited religious activities happened in secret. All of this represented economic activity that, while not contributing to the formal economy, was real and significant. The psychological toll of Roman nights accumulated over lifetimes. Children who grew up afraid of the dark, who experienced trauma during night hours, who witnessed violence or suffered abuse under cover of darkness, carried those experiences into adulthood. They raised their own children with the same fears, passing down both practical survival knowledge and psychological damage through generations. Romans didn't have concepts of trauma or post-traumatic stress, but they experienced these conditions nonetheless. People who had survived major fires often became hypervigilant at night, waking at the slightest smell of smoke, unable to relax enough to sleep deeply. People who had been attacked or robbed at night developed patterns of avoidance and hyper-awareness. These weren't seen as medical or psychological issues, but simply as part of the normal range of human responses to living in Rome. The collective psychological impact of thousands of difficult nights over a lifetime must have shaped Roman culture in ways we can barely begin to understand. The Stoic philosophy that emphasized endurance, self-control, and acceptance of fate makes more sense when you understand that Romans were enduring genuine hardship constantly. The focus on public life and public achievement makes more sense when you realize that private life, especially nighttime private life, was often unpleasant enough that distraction was necessary. The Roman appreciation for spectacle, for public entertainments, for anything that could occupy the mind and distract from daily realities, becomes more understandable when you consider what daily realities actually included. If every night meant fear and discomfort, then daytime pleasures, even violent ones like gladiatorial games, might seem worth the moral cost. If you spent half your life enduring darkness, you might well develop a culture that celebrated light, order, and civilization with almost desperate intensity. The morning after a storm brought fresh air and cooler temperatures, at least temporarily. People emerged from their homes grateful for the relief and anxious about any damage. Flooding was common. Rome's drainage system was good by ancient standards, but still inadequate for heavy rain. Water would pool in low-lying streets, mixing with sewage and creating foul-smelling swamps that took days to drain. As night progressed toward dawn, subtle changes began. The deepest part of night was around the fourth watch, roughly 3 to 6 in the morning. This was when the city was quietest, when even the taverns had mostly closed and the carts had finished their deliveries. The darkness felt heavier then, more complete, and people sleeping in their broken pattern often woke during these hours. The wakeful period in the middle of the night had an eerie quality. You were alone with your thoughts in a silence that daytime Rome never experienced. No voices, no footsteps, just the occasional distant dog and the sound of your own breathing. Some people found this peaceful, a rare moment of true solitude. Others found it unsettling, too much time to think about worries and fears. Thoughts that seemed manageable during the day grew larger in nighttime darkness. Concerns about money, about health, about relationships, all expanded to fill the quiet. People lay there working through problems, making plans, having imaginary conversations. The philosophers said this was good, that self-examination led to wisdom. The reality was often just anxiety spiraling in the dark. But gradually, imperceptibly at first, the darkness would begin to thin, not with light, not yet, but with sound. Roosters crowed first, multiple birds throughout the city, answering each other. Romans kept chickens even in the city, for eggs and meat, and the roosters were notoriously loud. Their crowing signaled that dawn was approaching, though it was still an hour or more away. Other sounds followed. Bakers already had their ovens going, and the smell of fresh bread began to drift through streets. Early risers, people who had to travel long distances to work, started moving around, their footsteps echoing in the still dark streets. Doors opened and closed. Conversations began, quiet at first, then gradually louder as more people emerged. The sky lightened slowly at first, then faster. Deep black became dark blue, then lighter blue at the eastern horizon. Stars faded one by one, the brightest holding on longest. The morning star, Venus, hung in the sky until the sun was nearly up, and Romans made wishes on it, asking for luck in the coming day. Shutters opened with a sound like thunder as thousands of windows unsealed simultaneously. Wood scraped against wood, bars slid free from brackets, cool morning air rushed into rooms that had been sealed all night. The psychological relief was immediate and overwhelming. You'd survived. Your family had survived. Another day had been granted. People emerged cautiously at first, looking around, assessing the neighborhood, checking for damage from the night, for evidence of crimes, for anything unusual that might signal danger. Neighbors greeted each other, quick exchanges confirming everyone had made it through. The conversations were brief but meaningful, acknowledging the shared experience of nighttime vulnerability. Water had to be fetched immediately. In the insulae, someone, usually a slave or child, had to go down to the ground floor fountain or out to the nearest public fountain. They carried clay jugs that would be filled and carried back up narrow stairs. The conversations at the fountain were where news spread, where you learned what had happened overnight in other parts of the building or neighborhood. Inside homes, people washed quickly with cold water, splashing faces and hands, sometimes the whole body if you were particularly devout about cleanliness. The wealthy had slaves heat water for them, providing the luxury of warm washing, but even they rarely heated enough for full bathing. That would come later at the public baths. Morning was for quick, practical cleansing, removing sleep from your eyes, preparing to face the day. Teeth were cleaned with twigs or rough cloth, sometimes with powder made from crushed bone or pumice. The goal was removing food particles and freshening breath, not what we'd consider dental hygiene. Most Romans had terrible teeth by modern standards, worn down by coarse bread, rotted by lack of care, painful but endurable because there was no alternative. Morning prayers were essential, acknowledgement that the household gods had protected the family through another night. Small offerings were placed on the shrine, bread or wine or a pinch of incense if you could afford it. The prayers were brief and formulaic, thanks for protection, requests for continued favor. Even families that weren't particularly religious maintained this ritual because superstition and tradition were too deeply ingrained to ignore. Children were examined by parents with anxious attention. Any sign of illness, any cough or fever or unusual behavior was noted with concern. Disease killed quickly in Rome, especially the young and old. A child healthy at bedtime could be sick by morning, and sick by morning could mean dead by nightfall. Parents had to be vigilant, watching for early symptoms so they could act before illness became unstoppable. Breakfast was minimal for most people. A piece of bread, maybe dipped in wine or water to soften it. Some cheese if the family had any, olives if they were in season. Wealthy families added fruit or honey, but even they didn't eat heavily at breakfast. The main meal would come later, during or after work. Morning was for fuel, not pleasure. Slaves were dispatched on errands immediately, shopping for fresh food at markets that opened at dawn, delivering messages to other households, taking children to tutors or schools if the family could afford education. The streets filled rapidly with people moving purposefully, everyone trying to accomplish morning tasks before the heat made everything harder. Street vendors set up their stalls along major streets, calling out their wares in voices hoarse from years of shouting. Fresh bread still warm from the ovens. Vegetables brought in from farms outside the city. Fish from the Tiber market, laid out on tables, eyes already going dull. The smell of commerce, food and bodies and animals replaced the smell of nighttime fear. Workers gathered at job sites, day labourers standing in groups, hoping to be selected for work. Construction projects, loading docks, any task that required strong backs and willing hands. The selection was arbitrary, foremen choosing men they knew or men who looked strongest, or men who offered bribes. Those not chosen would try again tomorrow, or would find other ways to survive another day. Shops opened, shutters pulled up, goods arranged for display. Craftsmen sat at their benches, already working, hands moving with practiced skill. Potters and metalworkers and woodworkers and leatherworkers, each in their small shops, creating the goods that made Roman civilization function. The sound of their work, hammering and scraping and the potter's wheel spinning, added to the growing noise. The wealthy emerged later, after slaves had prepared them properly. Hair arranged, togas draped correctly, faces washed and oiled until skin gleamed. They moved through streets with entourages, heading to the forum for business or to the baths for socializing. Their presence announced status, reminded everyone of Rome's hierarchy, reinforced the social order that night had temporarily suspended. But rich and poor shared one thing that morning: relief. Another night had passed. The fears that seemed overwhelming in darkness felt manageable in daylight. The cycle had completed again, and you'd survived to see it. There was work ahead, problems to solve, life to live. But first, there was simply gratitude for light and warmth and the simple fact of morning. The sun climbed higher and Rome fully woke. The tentative early movements became confident action. Noise levels rose from murmur to roar. Markets filled with shoppers. Courts opened for legal business. Teachers began lessons. The city that had been dark and dangerous and terrifying transformed back into the empire's proud capital, the place where civilization itself was defined and defended. For a few hours each morning, Romans could forget the night. They could pretend that light was permanent, that safety was guaranteed, that the darkness wouldn't return. They knew better, had known better their entire lives. But the pretense felt necessary, a psychological respite from the constant awareness of vulnerability. So they worked and argued and traded and lived, pushing the memory of night to the back of their minds. But the memory never left entirely. It sat there, quiet but present, reminding them that sunset would come again, that they'd have to retreat into their homes again, that they'd have to face the darkness again. Every single night for their entire lives the cycle would repeat. Darkness falls, endure fear, wait for dawn, over and over, without variation, without escape. This shaped everything about Roman civilization. Their architecture, their religion, their social structures, their psychology. They built an empire during the day, but they built it knowing that night would always return. They conquered territories and organized provinces, but they couldn't conquer darkness. They wrote laws and philosophies, but they couldn't write away fear. The contrast between day and night in Rome reveals something fundamental about their civilization. During the day, they were masters of the world, confident and powerful, bringing order to chaos. At night, they were just humans, vulnerable and afraid, hoping to survive until morning. The gap between those two states was enormous, and Romans lived in both simultaneously, always aware that one would transform into the other with the setting sun. Their relationship with night shaped their understanding of life itself. They didn't expect comfort or safety. They expected hardship and danger, with brief periods of relief. Night was the natural state, darkness the default condition. Day was the exception, the gift, the temporary suspension of normal reality. This wasn't pessimism. It was realism forged through generations of experience. Modern people struggle to understand this mindset because we've eliminated most nighttime dangers. We can create light at will, can summon help instantly, can move through our world at any hour with reasonable safety. We think of night as simply the dark half of day, a time for leisure or sleep or activity depending on our choice. Romans had no such luxury. Night was survival time. Period. Yet they adapted, as humans always do. They developed strategies and rituals and beliefs that made nighttime bearable. They created communities of mutual protection. They maintained faith that dawn would come because it always had. They passed survival knowledge to their children, teaching them how to live in a world where darkness was genuinely threatening. And in adapting, they created something remarkable. A civilization that could build aqueducts and conquer continents while spending half its existence huddled in darkness. They proved that humans could achieve extraordinary things even while living in conditions we'd consider intolerable. The marble temples and grand forums existed because Romans refused to let nighttime fear stop daytime ambition. Their nights also created intimacy that modern life has lost. Families pressed together in darkness, sharing warmth and fear and stories. Neighbors looking out for each other because survival sometimes required cooperation. Children learning to navigate the world through touch and sound and memory, developing senses we've let atrophy. There was beauty in that closeness, even if Romans themselves might not have recognized it while shivering in the dark. The end of Roman nights came gradually, over centuries. As the empire grew wealthier, lighting improved slowly. Glass became more common, allowing windows that admitted light without admitting weather. Oil lamps became more efficient, burning brighter and longer. Some neighborhoods funded minimal street lighting, torches mounted on walls at intersections, creating small islands of light in the darkness. Christianity's rise changed Roman nights in subtle ways. The new religion emphasized charity and community care, creating networks that looked after vulnerable members. Christian communities would check on sick or elderly members after dark, bringing food or medicine, providing companionship. This wasn't revolutionary, but it did create different nighttime social patterns, bonds based on shared faith rather than patron-client relationships or family ties. The church also changed how Romans thought about darkness. Christianity taught that night was when demons were most active, but also that faith provided protection. Prayer could ward off evil, sacred objects could create safe spaces, and martyrs who died for their beliefs could intercede on behalf of the living. The old household gods gradually gave way to Christian saints, but the basic transaction remained the same: devotion in exchange for protection through the dangerous hours. But for most of Rome's history, for the centuries when it dominated the Mediterranean world and shaped Western civilization, the nights remained essentially unchanged. Darkness fell, people retreated, danger prowled, morning came. The cycle was as fundamental to Roman life as the changing seasons, as inevitable as death, as necessary as breathing. The last generation of Romans who lived through these nights, who knew no other way, probably couldn't imagine a world where darkness was controlled. They'd seen improvements, slightly better lighting, slightly more security, but the basic reality remained. Night was dangerous, vigilance was required, and survival meant enduring until dawn. That's what night had always been, what they assumed it would always be. We know now that they were wrong, that humanity would eventually conquer darkness, turning night into an extension of day through artificial light, that their descendants would move through darkness without fear, would sleep through entire nights without waking, would consider their nightly terror ancient and incomprehensible. But Romans living through those nights had no way to imagine such a future. They lived in their present, managed their fears, maintained their rituals, and survived. Night after night, year after year, generation after generation. They raised children who grew up to raise more children, all of them learning the same lessons about darkness and danger and endurance. They built a civilization that lasted 1,000 years, and they did it while spending half that time in conditions we can barely imagine. Looking at Roman knights from our comfortable distance, we see both what they lost and what they had. They lost safety, comfort, the simple ability to move through their world without fear. But they had resilience we've forgotten, connections we've abandoned, an appreciation for dawn that we'll never feel. They knew darkness intimately, respected it deeply, and survived it continuously. Their nights teach us something about human adaptability. We think we need certain things to function, certain levels of comfort and safety and convenience. Romans prove we don't. They functioned, they thrived, they built an empire, all while living nightly through conditions we'd consider a crisis. They had no choice but to adapt, and so they did, finding ways to make the unbearable bearable through ritual and community and sheer stubbornness. They also teach us about the relationship between light and civilization. Romans believed deeply that they represented order against chaos, civilization against barbarism, light against darkness. And yet, they spent every night confronting genuine darkness, genuine chaos, genuine vulnerability. The contrast between their daylight confidence and nighttime fear wasn't hypocrisy. It was the human condition made visible. We've changed the conditions. We've eliminated most of what Romans feared at night, replaced genuine darkness with artificial light, turned night into another time for activity rather than a time for survival. But we haven't changed human nature. We still fear the unknown, still seek safety, still find comfort in light and community. We've just relocated those fears to different contexts, managed them with different tools. Romans faced their fears directly every single night. They couldn't eliminate the threats, couldn't change the conditions, so they developed the psychological and social structures necessary to endure. They created gods to protect them, rituals to ward off danger, communities to provide mutual support. And they taught their children that life was hard, but you faced it anyway because the alternative was giving up. Modern people might look at Roman knights with pity or horror, grateful we don't live that way anymore. But there's also something worthy of respect in how Romans handled their reality. They didn't pretend night was safe. They didn't ignore the dangers or wishfully think they'd go away. They acknowledged the truth of their situation and found ways to survive it with their humanity intact. The stories they told at night, the prayers they whispered in darkness, the comfort they took from each other's presence, all of it was practical magic for managing fear. Not magic that changed reality, but magic that changed how you experienced reality, making the unbearable bearable through shared belief and shared ritual. We've lost much of that magic, replaced it with technology and institutions, but the human need it addressed remains. Roman nights ended eventually, not with dramatic change but with gradual transformation. Better lighting, better security, better housing, all accumulated over centuries until night became less threatening. The collapse of the Western Empire actually made things worse for a while, as infrastructure decayed and security disappeared entirely. Medieval Europeans experienced nights as dark and dangerous as anything Romans knew, sometimes darker. But the trajectory was toward light, toward safety, toward the conquest of darkness. Romans couldn't see that future, couldn't imagine that their descendants would live so differently. They lived in their present, endured their nights, and assumed the pattern would continue forever. Every civilization makes that assumption, believes its current conditions are permanent, fundamental, unchangeable. We make the same assumption now. We think our control over darkness is permanent, that we'll always have artificial light, always have security, always have the comfort we've created. Maybe we're right, or maybe future generations will look back at us the way we look at Romans, seeing both our achievements and our blind spots, understanding what we gained and what we lost. What remains constant is the human experience of night, the darkness that falls when the sun sets, whether we illuminate it or not. The vulnerability that comes with sleep, whether we acknowledge it or not. The relief of morning, whether we notice it or not. Romans lived closer to these fundamental experiences, couldn't insulate themselves from them the way we can. That closeness came with terrible costs. The fear, the discomfort, the constant danger, all of it extracted a price from every Roman who lived through it. Children grew up anxious. Adults lived with chronic stress. The elderly died from complications of lives lived too hard. No one would choose to return to those conditions if they understood what they truly entailed. But something was gained too, though Romans themselves might not have recognized it as gain, a relationship with darkness that was honest and direct, an appreciation for light that was visceral and immediate, a connection to family and community forged through shared vulnerability, a toughness born from enduring what couldn't be changed. Every morning when Rome woke, it was a small victory. Every family that survived the night intact had won something real. Every dawn proved that endurance was possible, that humans could face darkness and emerge unchanged. The cycle repeated endlessly, but it repeated because Romans kept facing it, kept enduring, kept surviving. In the end, Roman nights were about resilience. Not the dramatic resilience of heroes, but the quiet resilience of ordinary people doing what had to be done. They closed their doors at sunset, knowing what the night might bring. They lay in darkness, knowing they might not see morning. They held their children close, knowing protection was uncertain. And they did it anyway, night after night, because life required it. Every morning, Rome rose from darkness. Every night, it descended again. And in that endless rhythm between light and shadow, an empire learned to sleep with one eye open, listening for dawn.